In the years after Hannibal's defeat and the slow unraveling of Egypt's once mighty influence, a space opened in the eastern Mediterranean, a power vacuum waiting for someone bold enough to step into it, and Philip V of Macedon was nothing if not bold. He had grown up in the long shadow of Alexander, heir to a kingdom that still remembered what it meant to rule across continents, but by the time Philip sat on the throne, Macedon was no longer the master of the world, it was surrounded by nervous allies, watchful enemies, and fragile balances that were just waiting to tip. But Philip didn't want to be a caretaker of decline, he wanted to revive greatness, to expand, to move, to act, and so he began, first by striking east against cities in Asia Minor, testing the defenses of weakened powers like Pergamon and Rhodes. Then by forging a daring alliance with the Seleucid king Antiochus III, a partnership built not on trust, but on shared ambition and mutual greed. Together, they set their eyes on the remnants of Egypt's overseas holdings, Ptolemaic cities scattered across the Aegean and Western Asia, and as Antiochus marched east, Philip moved west, sending ships, soldiers, and fear across the sea. To the outside world, he looked like a man with no fear, but beneath the armor and proclamations was a ruler walking a narrow line, playing a dangerous game in a world full of shifting loyalties. His fleet attacked cities on the Aegean coast, he besieged places like Abydos with brutal efficiency, and in every move, he challenged the delicate structure that held the Greek world together. He wasn't just conquering, he was rewriting the rules, and that made him both admired and feared. But in his hunger for expansion, Philip made enemies faster than he could hold ground. Rhodes and Pergamon, alarmed and wounded, sent envoys begging Rome to intervene. The Ptolemies, though weakened, whispered from afar. And even some in mainland Greece, old rivals and old allies, watched his rise with clenched fists and silent prayers. Philip had become the storm on the horizon, and while he saw himself as the heir of Alexander, many others saw something darker, another tyrant, another threat, another war waiting to happen. And still, he pushed forward. Because for Philip, hesitation was weakness. Because in the fragile quiet after Hannibal and before Rome's eastward gaze had fully sharpened, he believed there was time to act, to seize, to become the pivot point of a new order. But what he underestimated, what many underestimated, was how quickly Rome could turn its attention, and how fiercely it could fight when it finally did. Philip had no idea that in just a few years, he would be standing on a foggy hill in Thessaly, staring across a battlefield at the very edge of his world, a battlefield that would decide not just his fate, but the fate of an entire era of warfare. But for now, he was still the king who believed that Macedon could rise again. And in the silence between wars, that belief was enough to move the world. When the cries for help first reached Rome, they sounded distant, almost like echoes bouncing off marble walls, urgent voices from across the Adriatic warning of Philip's ambitions, of fleets moving through the Aegean, of cities besieged and treaties shattered, but for the Roman Senate. Still catching its breath after the terror of Hannibal, it was hard to imagine why Macedon's skirmishes should matter when Italy itself had only just been stitched back together with blood and ash. The memories of Cannae were still fresh, and the fields of Tarentum still bore the scars of war, and so the senators listened, but they did not yet act. For a moment, Rome stood still, cautious, hesitant, wondering whether it was truly ready to trade one war-weary sea for another. But the world had changed. Philip was not just attacking minor cities, he was testing the limits of Roman influence, pushing into a vacuum Rome didn't even realize it had left open. Rhodes and Pergamon, allies in all but name, were bleeding, and even the Ptolemies, weak as they were, felt the tremors of his ambition. And so the Senate debated, as it always did, in columns and togas, with voices rising not from emotion but from memory, until one voice made the difference, a consul named Publius Sulpicius Galba, a man who stood before the assembly and reminded them not of Greece, but of Pyrrhus. Of the scars Roman men still bore from the days Macedonian phalanxes had first marched west, of the warnings left unanswered until it was too late. Galba did not plead for war, he warned of silence. And that, more than anything, turned the tide. In 200 BC, Rome declared war on Philip V of Macedon, not out of vengeance, not out of greed, but out of a sense of inevitability, of momentum, of history rising to meet itself again. This was not a war of emotion, it was strategic, calculated, almost reluctant. Rome wasn't chasing glory in Greece. It was chasing stability, influence, control over a region too important to be left in the hands of a king it did not trust. And so, Roman legions crossed the Adriatic, for the second time in history, not to repel an invader but to draw a line, to show the Greek world that the Republic was no longer just the master of Italy, but something larger, something watching. And in that moment, Rome changed. No longer reactive, no longer on the defensive, it began to step into the role that history had prepared for it, an arbiter of foreign affairs, a force that would not simply respond to crisis, but reshape the world to avoid one. And Philip, bold as he was, had no idea that the enemies he had mocked as slow, distant, and tired had just decided to meet him, not on his terms, but on a battlefield of their choosing. The war had begun, and with it, a quiet truth began to unfold, that in deciding to intervene, Rome had taken its first real step into the eastern Mediterranean, and it would never look back. When Titus Quinctius Flamininus arrived in Greece, he was not what most expected, a man too young for the weight of command, too polished for the battlefield, more senator than soldier in a land still echoing with the names of men like Alexander. But beneath the youthful face and aristocratic poise was a mind forged in the politics of the Republic and a heart that beat in rhythm with the ideals of Greek culture, and that made him something rare in Roman leadership, an idealist with ambition. He didn't see Greece the way his predecessors had, as just another arena of strategy and conquest. He saw it as something to be understood, preserved, even liberated, and that vision, whether sincere or strategic, shaped every step he took from the moment his feet touched Greek soil. Unlike the older commanders who marched with iron detachment, Flamininus spoke Greek fluently, read its history, quoted its philosophers, and styled himself not as a conqueror but as a restorer, and whether it was theater or truth, the Greeks noticed. He met with philosophers and kings, dined in cities older than Rome itself, and slowly, city by city, he shifted the narrative, not just from Macedonian control to Roman intervention, but from fear to possibility. And yet, for all his charm and polish, he was no stranger to war. He understood that words alone couldn't break a phalanx, that alliances forged in wine and conversation still needed to be backed by steel, and so while he courted the hearts of Greece, he also studied the movements of Philip, watched the hills and roads of Thessaly, placed his forces carefully, drilled them relentlessly, and prepared for the moment when diplomacy would end and the test of arms would begin. He knew Philip was no fool. The Macedonian king had grown cautious after years of pressure, more calculating than reckless, and though he had lost ground, he still commanded one of the most disciplined armies in the world, anchored by a weapon that had broken empires for generations, the Macedonian phalanx. But Flamininus believed in something different. He believed in the flexibility of the Roman legion, in the strength of its maniples, in the initiative of its officers, in the speed and adaptability that had brought victory in the rugged hills of Italy and the open plains of Spain, and he believed that if he could choose the right ground, if he could catch Philip where the phalanx could not breathe, he could break more than an army, he could break a legacy. And yet, what made Flamininus dangerous was not just that he could win battles, it was that he understood the story he was writing as he fought them. He framed his campaign not as an occupation, but as a liberation. He promised cities their freedom, temples their guardianship, and citizens their dignity, all under the watchful eye of Roman protection. He handed out freedom like it was policy, but each gift bound the Greeks tighter to Rome's embrace. It was brilliance disguised as generosity, strategy cloaked in idealism, and for a while, it worked. By the time the two armies began to move toward each other in earnest, Flamininus had already won half the war, not in the field, but in the hearts of the people who once feared him. And when the moment finally came, when the fog settled on the hills of Cynoscephalae, he knew that what happened next would not just define his career, it would decide the balance of power between Rome and Macedon for generations to come. Because Flamininus wasn't just marching to defeat a king, he was marching to finish what Pyrrhus had started and what Alexander had left behind, to redefine what military greatness looked like, not with pikes and tight formations, but with the Roman principle of order through flexibility. strength through adaptation, and victory earned not just by muscle, but by mind. The hills of Cynoscephalae rose quietly out of the Thessalian plain like the spine of a sleeping beast, and on that grey morning in 197 BC, the fog hung thick and low, curling around the ridges and valleys, muffling every hoofbeat, every command, every heartbeat, and in that haze, two armies moved toward each other without fully knowing where the other stood, two forces shaped by centuries of military tradition, one rigid and ancient, the other flexible and unproven in this land, each guided by instinct, fear, and the knowledge that whatever happened next would echo far beyond the hills. Philip V's army moved first, his phalanx grinding uphill in pieces, not as a single wall but in staggered waves, confused by the mist, by the terrain, by the urgency of their scouts who had reported Roman movements nearby but couldn't say how many or exactly where, and Philip, ever bold but increasingly pressed by time, ordered his men forward, sending half his force toward the ridgeline while the rest remained behind, still assembling, still unready. On the Roman side, Flamininus hesitated only for a moment before seizing the opportunity, sending his light infantry and cavalry to probe the hill, to test the enemy's position, to find a weakness in the fog, and what they found was chaos, a Macedonian advance not yet formed, vulnerable, disconnected from its center. The fighting began not as a grand clash, but as a series of ambushes, skirmishes, moments of confusion and brilliance, and in the midst of it, one Roman tribune made a decision that would turn the tide of the war. Seeing the disarray of the Macedonian right, he broke protocol and led his unit in a flanking maneuver, striking the enemy from behind just as they were trying to anchor their line, and the phalanx, once formed and nearly invincible, began to crack, not from the front, but from within. From the disruption of its shape, its unity, its soul. The other half of Philip's army, still at the base of the hills, was ordered forward too late, forced to march into terrain that shattered the logic of the phalanx, terrain that favored the Roman maniples, those small, mobile units trained to fight in segments, to adjust, to pivot, to kill in the gaps. And once those gaps opened, once the phalanx could no longer hold its perfect line of spears and shields, it was no longer a wall, it was a maze, a trapped beast surrounded by wolves. The Romans surged forward, not in a single push, but in coordinated chaos, each unit acting with autonomy, responding to terrain and enemy alike, carving through the Macedonian left even as the right collapsed under the weight of its own formation. What made the phalanx beautiful was also what made it vulnerable. It required space, order, and cohesion, but the hills of Cynoscephalae offered none of those things, and in that brutal, muddy, mist-covered moment, a military system that had defined Greek warfare for centuries met its match. Not in size or strength, but in adaptation. Philip watched from a distance as his army disintegrated, his commands drowned in the fog, his retreat inevitable, and when it was over 8,000 of his men lay dead and 5,000 more were captured, not because they fought poorly, but because they fought in a world that no longer matched their training. And Flamininus, standing on the ridgeline, knew what this meant, not just a victory, but a shift, a signal that the Roman way of war had surpassed the Macedonian, that the age of the phalanx was ending, and a new military order, one built on flexibility, speed, and the calculated initiative of its officers, was rising from the mist. The clash between Rome and Macedon at Cynoscephalae was not just a battle of armies, it was a collision of military philosophies, a test of two systems born in different centuries, raised on different terrains, forged by different visions of what it meant to be invincible. And as the fog thinned and the hills shook with the sounds of steel and shouted orders, the heart of the battle revealed something ancient and something new facing each other across blood-soaked ground. On one side stood the Macedonian phalanx, a wall of men braced behind pikes stretching 20 feet long, trained to move as one, to crush opposition with slow, relentless pressure, a machine that had once carried Alexander across half the world, a formation that had broken Persians, Indians, and even early Romans, and that now advanced again with terrifying beauty, until the ground betrayed it. Cynoscephalae was not flat, not smooth, not the kind of battlefield the phalanx was built to dominate, and as it climbed the ridges and twisted through narrow passes, its long spears tangled, its ranks broke rhythm, and its greatest strength, unity, began to crack. The Romans saw it happen. They didn't panic. They adapted. Each maniple, smaller and more independent than a Macedonian unit, moved with purpose, pivoted around stones, flanked on instinct, filled gaps with speed and precision, and when they met the phalanx head-on, they didn't try to push it back, they slid past it, slipped into its seams, and struck where the pikes couldn't reach. The Roman pilum, heavy and short-ranged, was not a dueling weapon, it was a tool of disruption, designed to bend on impact and render shields useless, to throw off balance just long enough to create an opening, and that opening was all the Roman sword, the gladius, needed. At close range, the long Macedonian pikes were no better than walking sticks, and once the Romans broke through the first few rows, they turned the structure of the phalanx against itself. Macedonian soldiers couldn't swing freely, couldn't pivot to face the attack coming from behind or the side, and as the Romans pressed forward in bursts of brutal, coordinated violence, the mighty formation began to collapse not in a roar, but in 1,000 fractures. On the Macedonian left, some units held longer, pushing Romans back with steady discipline, and for a time, it looked as though the phalanx might recover, that the old way might prevail one more time, but battles are not won by holding in one place, they are won by breaking the enemy's will. And on the right, where the Roman flanking maneuver had succeeded, Macedonian morale began to collapse like shattered stone. It wasn't just that the Romans were killing them, it was that they were doing it in places the phalanx had no answer for, moving faster, responding faster, adapting faster, and what started as a slow grind became a rout. Some Macedonians threw down their weapons and ran. Some fought to the end, trapped in a formation that no longer served them. Some looked to Philip for a signal that never came. And when it was over, when the pikes lay broken on the hillside and Roman soldiers stood bloodied but victorious, something much larger than a battle had been decided. The age of the phalanx, the symbol of Greek military dominance, had met its end on a hill in Thessaly, not because it was weak, but because it could no longer keep up with a world that demanded flexibility, initiative, and depth. And the Roman legion, with its small units and disciplined aggression, had proven itself not just adaptable, but superior, not just in force but in design. From that day forward, the question was no longer whether Rome could match the great armies of the East, it was whether anyone else could match Rome. When the smoke cleared from the hills of Cynoscephalae and the last Macedonian pike clattered to the ground, Philip V was no longer a king of ambition, he was a survivor, retreating not just from the battlefield but from the legacy he had tried to reclaim. Because in a single morning of fog and blood, the old image of Macedonian supremacy had shattered, and what remained was a broken army, 8,000 dead, 5,000 taken prisoner, and a monarch forced to reckon with the brutal clarity of defeat. He returned to Pella not in triumph but in silence, carrying the weight of a kingdom that had lost its edge, and though he would continue to wear a crown and speak with the voice of a king, the truth was that Macedon was no longer its own master. In the peace talks that followed, held in the Tempe Valley beneath the quiet shadow of Mount Olympus, Philip was stripped not of his throne, but of his pride, his fleet was dismantled, his war elephants taken, his sons handed over as hostages. And the once mighty Macedonian army reduced to a symbolic shell of its former self. But perhaps the deepest wound was not inflicted by treaty or tribute, but by the way the Romans framed their victory, not as conquest but as liberation, because Flamininus, with his smooth tongue and statesman's gaze, stood before a crowd of Greek city-states at the Isthmian Games and declared that Rome had come not to rule, but to set Greece free. The words rang through the stadium like thunder, freedom for the Greeks, freedom from foreign kings, freedom under Roman watch, and the crowd erupted, cheering a republic that promised no occupation, no taxes, only the restoration of Hellenic dignity. But the truth, as it always is in war, was more complicated. Philip was no longer the threat, but the balance of power had shifted forever. Rome had inserted itself not as an invader but as an arbiter, a protector, a presence that would never fully leave, and while the Greeks toasted their newfound autonomy, Roman garrisons lingered, Roman allies multiplied, and Roman interests slowly spread through every forum and council. Macedon still existed on the map, but it was no longer feared, no longer respected in the way it once had been, and Philip, once the boldest king of the Aegean, now spent his days reshaping what little power he had left, watching his son Demetrius grow up under Roman eyes. Knowing that every decision he made from now on would be measured not by ambition, but by compliance. And so an empire came undone not in ruin or fire, but in managed decline, in quiet terms written on parchment, in foreign oversight masked as freedom, and in that moment, Rome revealed its genius, not just in battle, but in narrative, in diplomacy. In knowing that sometimes the most effective conquest doesn't look like conquest at all. It was not the end of Macedon, but it was the end of what Macedon had meant, and the Greek world, now cheering its liberty, had unknowingly stepped into the orbit of a power that would shape its future far more deeply than Philip ever could. This was how Rome expanded, not by erasing kings, but by leaving them in place with their swords blunted and their hands tied, and as Philip signed the terms and walked away from the table, he must have known, deep down, that something larger than territory had been lost, that the dream of a revived Hellenistic age had ended not in rebellion or glory, but in fog and cleverness and the quiet approval of a crowd who didn't yet understand that freedom, once gifted by another, is never truly your own. Cynoscephalae was more than a battle, it was a pivot, a quiet revolution in the art of war and the structure of empire, and though the hills of Thessaly would soon fall silent again, brushed by wind and the occasional shepherd's step, what had happened there would ripple through centuries, shaping the rise of Rome and the decline of a world built on the weight of the pike. For centuries, the Macedonian phalanx had been the measuring stick of military power, disciplined, elegant, relentless in formation, but Cynoscephalae revealed its fatal flaw, not through speeches or theory but through blood and terrain, because in that foggy chaos, when the lines bent and the rhythm faltered, it became clear that power in war no longer belonged to the tightest formation but to the force that could adapt, pivot, and respond in real time to the unpredictable mess of the battlefield. The Roman legion wasn't flawless, it stumbled, it bled, it miscalculated, but it could breathe, it could bend without breaking, and that made it unstoppable in a world that no longer offered clean terrain or clear rules. But the true brilliance of Rome at Cynoscephalae wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. Rome didn't just win a war that day, it rewrote what it meant to be a victor. It stepped into the Greek world not as a conqueror in chains and fire, but as a liberator, a protector, a narrator who knew how to dress power in the language of freedom, and as cities celebrated their independence and statues were raised to Flamininus as a friend of Greece, few realized that the Republic had done something far more lasting than occupy land, it had occupied imagination. The idea that Rome could be both sword and savior, that it could fight and still claim the moral high ground, that it could dismantle an empire while appearing to preserve autonomy, this became the blueprint for Roman expansion, not by flattening everything in its path, but by folding foreign cultures into its orbit with just enough dignity left intact to make them grateful for their new place in the Roman world. And so the legacy of Cynoscephalae wasn't just the end of Macedonian power or the collapse of the phalanx, it was the birth of a new kind of empire, one built not only by legions but by optics, one that could fight with steel and rule with symbols. It was a lesson in subtlety, in perception, in the long game of power. And if you stood on those hills today, in the quiet where spears once clashed and bodies once fell, you wouldn't see ruins or monuments, you'd see a landscape that once carried the weight of two competing visions of order, and in the end, it was the more flexible one that endured. Rome didn't just win that day because it fought better, it won because it understood what came after. And that understanding would take it farther than any phalanx ever could.